Sonal is saying they can't hear anything. That's because nobody is speaking. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, great. So I'm going to start now. We're going to start recording. So hello, everybody. My name is Maria Elisa Christie. I'm the Director of Women and Gender in International Development here at Virginia Tech at the Center for International Research, Education, and Development. Welcome to our third for the semester Virtual Women and Gender in International Development discussion series. We're so happy that you all could join us. Thank you. Please do note that our event will be recorded. So if you don't want your image recorded, you can turn off your image. So, but by staying on, you're consenting to being recorded. And we will be posting the talk on through VT Works, our library, and everybody will have access to that later. So you're going to be on it if you don't take your image off. So I encourage everyone to check in via chat. Let's see, we've had a couple, not too many, and tell us something about yourself and where you're logging in from and maybe how you heard about this event. Mary's saying, yes, our speaker would like to know who's out there. So yeah, I don't see many people. And I know we have actually a lot more people registered. So I think some people are going to be coming in late. So we'll take just a little bit of time for people to do that. So I will say, hi, I am in Blacksburg. Somebody from British Columbia. Hi, Susan. Okay, I'm gonna, somebody from Columbus, Ohio. Cool. More folks from Virginia Tech and from Ohio State. So you can keep your eye on who's signing in. I'd like to, before introducing our statement, I would like to read the following land and labor acknowledgement statement. So Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tutelo-Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationships with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that legislation and practices like the Morrill Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found the Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native American nations from their lands, both locally and in Western territories. We understand that honoring Native peoples without explicit material commitments falls short of our institutional responsibilities. Through sustained, transparent, and meaningful engagement with the Tutelo-Monacan peoples and other Native nations, we commit to changing the trajectory of Virginia Tech's history by increasing Indigenous students, staff, and faculty recruitment and retention, diversifying course offerings, and meeting the growing needs of all Virginia tribes and supporting their sovereignty. We must also recognize that enslaved Black people generated revenue and resources used to establish Virginia Tech and were prohibited from attending until 1953. Through inclusive VT, the institutional and individual commitment to Ut Prosum that I may serve in the spirit of community, diversity, and excellence, we commit to advancing a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. So I just want to mention that the full calendar and any updates for this year's discussion series is on our website, although this is the last one that we have programmed right now. We're currently setting up the spring discussion series, but they will be, and if you are on our listserv, you will get information about that. So this discussion, Mary's presentation, will last approximately, the discussion overall approximately 40 minutes, her presentation about 20 minutes, followed by about 20 minutes of discussion and Q&A. All dial-in participants will be muted to enable the speaker to present without interruption. You're welcome to post questions at any time in the chat box throughout the conversation because we'll be tracking those and then I'll be asking those of Mary when she finishes. So if we have time and there's more questions after we get through those in the chat, we will ask you to raise your hand in the webinar controls and then unmute you so that you can ask Dr. Rodriguez your question directly or make a comment directly towards the end of the session. So in order for our discussion to be as rich as it can be, we need everyone to be respectful and treat each other with kindness and consideration without discriminatory behavior. So again, as I said, this is going to be recorded and you'll have access to it via our website or directly through our library. At the end, we'll send out a link to a survey. Please do answer that. It's very, very important to us. And then if you are a tweeter, please tweet tagging at WGD_VT. Okay, now I will introduce our speaker. The reason you're here, Dr. Mary Rodriguez is an associate professor of community leadership and development at The Ohio State University. As a leadership scholar and practitioner, she focuses on supporting communities in change processes at the individual, household, and community levels. She strives to develop research-based solutions to build more sustainable and resilient communities through the exploration of behavior change and leadership development. In the United States, through community engaged scholarship, she has worked with new American populations, investigating the social system's impact on access to resources. She's also worked internationally in Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East, investigating adoption of innovations, household food security and resilience, and governance of water systems. The title of her talk today is Women, Water, and Transformative Gender Research. So please welcome Dr. Rodriguez.
All right, hello everyone. I am very happy to be here with you today to share my presentation and to tell you a little bit about my research and the work that I do. So just checking, Maria Lisa, can you see my screen? Okay, wonderful. I'll go ahead and start my timer then. As Maria Lisa said, my name is Mary Rodriguez. My pronouns are she and her. I am a first-generation American and a Latina woman. I'm originally from Texas and an associate professor here at Ohio State University. I start with a few of my identities because that's the lens through which I do my work, the passion that I do, that I bring to my work, and the reason that I do what I do. So let me tell you a little bit about women, water, and gender transformative research. A few things that I want to cover today during our quick 20-minute session is to talk to you a little bit about the role of women in water. What does this look like for many women around the world? How can we harness and better the impact that we have on women and water resources and what we do in development for the lives of women and girls around the world? And then what is gender transformative research and how can we do this to change the dynamics of these women living in these scenarios? Before I start, I want to give some acknowledgements really quickly to our research group and our funders, Dr. Rebecca Gianotti, Dr. Amanda Robinson, myself, and two PhD students, Rafael Quijada Landaverde and Vinicius de Mello, were essential in completing this project. It was funded by USAID in partnership with the national governments of Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. And they were produced by the Governance Research on Water Systems Project, and is a responsibility of the Global Environment and Technology Foundation. And these views, of course, do not necessarily reflect USAID, the US government, or any partner governments. But I am excited to tell you some of the findings that we had and some of the work that we did and what this looks like in the countries of Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. So to start, I want to give you a few facts about women and water. Did you know that women and children spend a collective 200 million hours collecting water? That's per day, actually. On an average, women in low middle income countries can walk up to 6 kilometers, which is approximately 3.5 miles a day, carrying 20 liters of water, as you see the gal here with the bucket on her head. In some areas, this journey can take up to 15 hours per week. 15 hours per week collecting water. That's a significant amount of time that women and girls are spending on a resource that is absolutely necessary for the household's well-being. Did you know that in 2020, 2 billion people, which is 26% of the population, lack safely managed water resources? Safely managed water resources are defined as an improved drinking water source that is accessible on the premises, available when needed, and free of fecal and chemical contamination. These improved sources can be piped water, boreholes, protected dug wells or springs, and packaged or delivered water. However, when you start to break down those numbers, in sub-Saharan Africa, the number of people lacking safely managed water actually increased since 2020 over 40%. And of those 2,771,000,000 people lacked even basic drinking services, and 8 in 10 of them are in rural areas in the world. And one more. Did you know that for sustainable water resource management, local communities and especially women must be involved? And what does this look like? The sustainable goal number 6 from the United Nations, Water and Sanitation for All, includes a sub-target to support and strengthen the participation of local communities in improving water and sanitation management, including communities. It sounds very simple, but fewer than half of the reporting countries have laws or policies specifically to include women's participation in the management of their water and sanitation resources. Only 14 of 109 countries reported high levels of community or user participation for collaborative management and decision making. There is an absolute lack of women and communities integrated into the sustainable management of their water resources. There is a significant lack of financial and human resources to make this even happen. Approximately 6 out of 10 countries reported that the resources needed for community involvement are less than 50% that's actually needed to support community involvement. So when we start thinking about the impact that water has on the livelihoods of women, of their families, of their health and their well-being, we start to think about what can we do? Women risk a lot to be able to go get water for their families. Again, something that is absolutely essential to their livelihoods. They face dangers on these journeys, crossing conflict areas, risk of physical or sexual assault, and risk of traffic accidents, having to cross major roadways to be able to get water. This is where our project came in. How can we better understand sustainable solutions for the work that we do when it comes to bringing water to semi-arid areas and arid areas in specifically in sub-Saharan Africa? GROWS, the Governance Research on Water Systems Project, had an overarching goal to understand the governance challenges facing communities and explore examples of successful responses to them. We looked at specifically, when looking at water governance, through the lens of 4 different governance areas: transparency, accountability, trust, and equity. I want to tell you a little bit about each one of these sections and then tell you specifically what we found as it relates to women. Really quickly, some of the main factors that we found in our research: we did interviews and focus groups with users, stakeholders at the government and non-governmental level to better understand what was going on. What does water governance actually look like? On the 4 levels of water governance that we explored, we found that transparency in the system, when users were aware of their money and how it was being spent, was more likely to increase their willingness to pay for water and trust the provider. So transparency was in communication. Where is the water? How good is the water? The quality of the water? Where is the money going to? How much are we going to have to spend? If we put in labor, what does that equate into the ownership of this water source? So this transparency of information was really, really essential. We also found that accountability from both the water users to the managers, but also to the providers and back. We saw that it was absolutely necessary for trust. In increasing a community sense of ownership and involvement of the system itself led to greater accountability between the users and the service providers in a bi-directional manner. In order to help to increase the governance, the good governance of a water source, we found that accountability actually really touched all these areas of governance in order for it to happen and to increase sustainability. We also looked at trust, and trust was mostly focused on the trustworthiness and reliability of the water system rather than the quality of water. Users found that they trusted the water that was coming out of the boreholes or the systems, the piped water systems and schemes. It was not necessarily about that. It was more about how it was actually being managed. Was it reliable? Would they bring water when we needed it? And could we trust the people that were managing the water source? Issues were identified in the ability of a user and the community to trust the service providers, attendants, and managers of the water system. Here we saw if money was being collected and transferred from hands from a person to a person, it could really be a breakdown in barriers of trust because they didn't know would that money actually be kept the way it needed to or used the way it needed to for the management of the water system. They also found that different technologies like water meters and smart meters, that kind of thing, would help with the trust, increasing the trust. I knew how much consumption I was taking. I knew how much money I was spending. It made me, the user, much more accountable and to trust the system that we were using. And finally, we looked at equity. And this was really interesting. When we sought equity, we wanted to understand how are people involved in the decision making. But interestingly enough, in our findings, in both our stakeholder interviews and our user interviews with communities, we found that they described equity in terms of assuring access to all people and equity in decision making, but mainly in the participation of women on the boards. Just having them, let's say, like they would say 50% of the board members needed to be women. That's really great, but did it actually equal participation? And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about the specific findings that are associated with women. So when we found these governance challenges, we tried to understand what does this look like if it's a community managed system or if it's a government managed system or a private entity. And what we found is that all four of these pieces actually transcended all of those different types of management schemes. In order for these things to be sustainable, we had to incorporate the community and the community's voice a lot more for the long-term work in water governance. So as it's related to women in water, there were a few things that we specifically found. Excuse me. In our interviews and in our focus groups, we asked women-only focus groups. We asked questions to mixed gender focus groups. We asked questions to better understand what is the impact that bringing water to a household or to a community, reducing the distance that women had to walk, what does that do for women in general? We see that there is a reduction in time spent collecting water. Women were spending up to 3 hours or more a day trying to go and collect water, and then we saw them collecting water much closer to their homes. Some of these piped schemes, like you see here at the hospital, this is actually at a little local hospital, excuse me, but these piped water schemes, or at least these communal water points, were much closer within a few hundred meters of the house, if not actually routed to the house. So a lot more time spent not collecting water, saved collecting water. We also saw increased safety while collecting water. One of the communities that we spoke to was right on a very, very major road, 2-lane road that was very, very busy, and people sped through the area. And they had several accidents of women and youth trying to cross the street with buckets of water, not being able to move very fast. And so you had traffic accidents. One of the things that they highlighted was an enormous change in the livelihoods of women and youth not having to cross that major street anymore. The accessibility of water just on their side of the street, that was a significant finding for them, significant change. We also found that women's participation is not equitable, does not equal decision making. So here we see that just because women are present on the board doesn't necessarily mean that they engaged in the decision making. The women told us that they were present, but oftentimes their voices were unheard, or they didn't feel comfortable to express themselves on the boards. And so just because they were present didn't mean at all that they were actually engaging in the decision making or the management of their water resources. This was an interesting finding. One of the things that we heard in one place in Tanzania, and we didn't hear it again in other places, but here they talked about the reduction in domestic violence. Men actually mentioned that there was less domestic violence in the household because women had more time to do all the other things in the household. And because they were saving time on water collection, they had the opportunity to do other things. So according to the men, there was a reduction in domestic violence. An interesting finding, and one that I have a lot of questions about. And the last one is decision making for water resources. We also talked to women who said, this is great. We're really excited and we're very happy that water has now been brought to our village or brought to our homes. But now we have to consider, and not that they didn't have to before, but now when we're paying for water, we need to consider what are the needs, immediate needs of my household. Is it water for agricultural or garden production, as well as the cooking and the cleaning and the consumption of water in my household? So they were having to determine, where do I get water for what purposes? If I'm gonna pay for water, is that gonna be solely for cooking, cleaning, and consumption? And then I go down to the creek or to an open well, and I take water from that to water my garden. But then I'm going 2 different places, and then I'm having to manage to keep the water separate. So we see that this is actually an issue for women now, starting to have to think, okay, how do I manage the money in my household? How do I pay for the water that I need? And what does that look like? Where do I use those water resources? So when we think of gender transformative research, I want to switch gears here a little bit and just kind of say that, with a caveat, that the work that we did was not gender transformative yet. And this is what I'm really hoping to get at. The work that we did was very much focused on being gender responsive. Our analysis of gender and identity was incorporated into both research and the programming practices. Our case, there was no programming practices, but we hope that the work that we did will actually lead to programming practices by our partners in the field in these 3 different countries. But we were gender responsive in our work. And I want to talk to you a little bit, though, about what it looks like to be gender transformative. We want to move, from being gender responsive to being gender transformative. This work is hard, and it takes a lot of practice and time, but it's trying to understand the root causes behind inequalities, and the research can lead to actual shifts in gender relations, interpersonality, and or at the structural level. If you study agency and empowerment, some of these words are probably very familiar to you. Structure and power are pieces that cannot be ignored when we talk about women. So gender transformative research is really trying to change relationships, change relations to promote equity to reach desired outcomes. It examines and questions the most fundamentally embedded norms, attitudes, behaviors, and practices, and the related imbalances in power that create these gender dynamics and difficulties for women in their communities. Gender transformative research takes a lot of time and propulsiveness in the design and the implementation of this work. So gender transformative research is really where we want to be, but oftentimes as academics or on short-term grants, it's very difficult to be gender transformative when the outcome is not always a programmatic one. So I just want to say that gender transformative research is an opportunity to strengthen the work that we do for and with women, but it is something that you have to be cognizant of and be prepared for. To actually perform gender transformative research, you want to incorporate the gender analysis and feminist principles, talking about structure, power, inequality, and agency, for example, at the beginning and in the design of the research process. You must build collaborations and partnerships with people that will advocate and use the research results for the change of the community. You want to define empowerment, and this is really, really important, not by your lens of empowerment, but based on the participant and contextual input. What do they believe empowerment looks like for those women in their communities and in their households? And finally, you want to focus on incremental change towards gender transformative change. You don't want to just have an endpoint. You want to make sure that your research can add to a plan of change that actually has steps to it and increments. You can never just arrive at an endpoint, but rather try and really be cognizant of this incremental change and how to facilitate that. So what does this look like then when it comes to this research? As I mentioned, this research in and of itself was not gender transformative. It was very gender responsive. But what could this look like in terms of what we found and what we're looking at? We can examine what structures, think laws and policies, for example, need to change to allow for women's true participation in managing water resources. This is going to take an entire research project to look at what does the community value in terms of women's participation and engagement in decision making. What are the norms surrounded by that? Those things can lead to changes in laws and changes in policies for communities and societies. Another question might be, what systematic changes are needed for both men and women to create community and societal changes to support women and girls as it relates to improved water access? At the end of the day, gender transformative research has to include both men and women in this process. You have to include folks of different genders to be able to do this. Societal and community change is very difficult. Taking a systems approach and thinking, what are all the ways that we need to think about women in water? An example of this was the finding on domestic violence. You wouldn't think domestic violence with water perhaps, or agricultural needs. You should think about agricultural needs with water, but the decision making as far as like, where do we route our resources, our very limited resources? So these are opportunities for us to expand the work that we've already done and actually create gender transformative research. All right, I did 17 seconds left, so I did pretty good, Maria Elisa. I am very thankful to be here, and I really look forward to our discussion today. Thanks so much.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we've gotten a couple of questions, not too many questions, so I'm hoping that you guys will be motivated either to write them in a text or to raise your hand. So Sunil first asked just a quick question: was the work in Tanzania and Dar es Salaam?
Okay, great question. No, the work in Tanzania was not in Dar es Salaam. The work in Tanzania was actually in rural Tanzania, in the Kilimanjaro region and a few other regions that are struggling with water resources in arid areas in the country. So we did not look at any urban centers at all. It was all rural communities.
Okay, and then someone asked another question that's not really related to water, but I'm going to ask it, and it is, do they understand what constitutes domestic violence or sex abuse?
Yeah, good question. That was not in the purview of our research, therefore we did not ask those questions. The way that it was worded to us was there is a reduction of arguments and beatings in the household. So we actually qualified the terminology and the words that were being used as domestic violence. But that's a really good question, and I think as I said, there's opportunities to do more research and to really delve further into what we found, and some of those questions that we wish we would have asked or had opportunities to explore further. I feel like every time you do a project, there's things that you wish you would have asked or wish you could have incorporated. Going back to the community is oftentimes either very difficult or impossible. To get more information. And so I think that for further research, it'd be very interesting to further explore the connection between domestic violence and water resources. I think that that would be really interesting, and a part of that would definitely be understanding what does that look like in the household, and in that context, what do they believe is inappropriate behavior and not. And then that's also where gender transformative research comes in, because that's where we can start to see what are the norms and behaviors and cultural attitudes towards the relationships, physical, in this sense, between men and women in the household, and how can we strive to change that if women are desiring that is not what they want for their well-being. So it definitely needs to come from that community. As I mentioned before, one of the things in transformative research is to ensure that women's empowerment is defined by the women themselves, because they will be the ones to say, this is what this needs to look like for our community, and it's not a global north definition that's being brought upon that community.
Great, thank you. Daniel, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and speak your own questions so we can actually transition into people using their mic, raising their hand. You have to use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to then pick. Let's see. I guess we have to get into where you can see people. But anyway, Daniel, if you could go ahead and speak your question, and then others, you're welcome to speak your question, or also to okay, I can read Linda's. I have one new one from Linda's, but Daniel, go ahead, please.
Sure. Thanks, Mary. I really enjoyed the presentation and how you really discussed the importance of distinguishing between gender responsive and gender transformative research. I was wondering, though, if you could just elaborate a little bit more on your work with your team and that process of starting to shift that your team's thinking on gender transformative research and starting to expand those boundaries. Just really excited to hear more from your experience.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel, for that question. My goal is to ultimately be able to do more gender transformative research, but the reality is a lot of times the capacity of grants, of timing, it really lends itself a lot easier to do gender responsive work. And so this is a journey for me. I want to just be very clear about this. It is something that I am constantly working on and constantly seeking to improve in my own practices. Making sure that I build bigger and deeper collaborations with our community and our advocates in that community as well will really impact the way that the research can transform the livelihoods of women, changing the structures that actually prohibit or inhibit women's engagement, decision-making agency over the resources that they have access to. I think that this is a great opportunity to get people thinking more about it, just like I am. How can we do this better? Thankfully, a lot of the funding agencies are getting more used to this language of gender transformative research and work. And so incorporating programming or incorporating the way that this research will directly apply to programming is something that we need to do better in our grant applications, and also advocating from USAID and other funders. So to be completely honest, it's still a journey for me, but it is something that I'm thoughtful about. And I want to just kind of say something about the work that I do. I most often strive to incorporate feminist critical theory into the work that I do. But feminist critical theory is different, and incorporating that lens is different than actually doing transformative work. And so I just want to say that out loud, because what I do and working and understanding advocacy and power dynamics and structures that are a part of the community can really stop oftentimes at the theoretical basis. And it's in theory, these are the things that we need to look at. And in theory, these are the things that we found that are important to this community for change. But transformative research actually takes that next step and says, okay, here are the things that we found. What does the community themselves help us to understand that can go into programmatic efforts to make these systemic changes? And so that's, I just want to kind of put that out there that, you can bring that important feminist lens to your work, but that next step for gender transformation, gender transformative research is not often taken and can be found as a difficult one.
Okay, so we got 3 questions right now. One from Linda, and then we have, I see, well, 2 people have raised their hands. So Linda has asked, would there be government and non-government grants available for nonprofits to further research involving women in water, and how can these be easily accessed?
Linda, what a great question. Yes, I believe that women in water, if you look at the funding available in different countries, especially as you look at programmatic areas within the big funding agencies, or if you look at what countries themselves are saying are needs for their communities, women and the water, the concept of understanding women in water, especially as it relates to water and sanitation and hygiene services, you can see that there is a lot of opportunity to do more research in this area. As far as funding goes, this is always the difficult part. Funders are very interested in certain programs and those initiatives, and so you'll have to really be you have to explore to see what kind of funding is available. And I'm not excellent at talking about funding, but I see that actually my colleague Rebecca Gianotti has her hand up, and she might be a really great resource. She is actually one of the folks that works for our Global Water Institute here at Ohio State University. Maria Lisa, can we go ahead and just unmute Rebecca? She might have an answer to this question.
Yes, she's already unmuted. She had already asked to speak before, so I think hopefully we'll be able to hear her. Rebecca, can you speak?
Yes, I'm here. I hadn't actually planned to speak about the grant. Her presentation prompted another question for me, and as someone who has been in this project, I think that speaks to Mary's great presentation. Regarding donor funding, my familiarity is with the bilateral donors, agencies like USAID, and I am starting to see them incorporate more, not just within their calls for various programs, a little section saying, and tell us about gender, but to really make it sort of front and center as part of how you design the proposal. So I am starting to see that come forward. I admit I'm not familiar with the European agency funding and what that might look like in the gender space. But from what I see, it is something that the agencies are starting to value more in a way that they haven't in the past.
All right, awesome. Thanks for chiming in there, Beck.
Let's see. I'm asking to unmute. Alistair, I think you have to unmute yourself.
I have. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
can.
Mary, I want to thank you really sincerely. I'm struggling with exactly what you're talking about in terms of gender responsiveness versus gender transformation. And you articulated the imperative and the ways of distinguishing between them really well. But I did want to follow up on the comments from you and from Rebecca, because yes, certainly in the Canadian scene, we are seeing granting agencies do more than pay lip service to gender. But they go to what they see as the gold standard, which is gender transformation as the first imperative that they want to achieve. And it's certainly been a struggle to get them to understand that to get to gender transformation, there's a lot of steps you need to go through with the community, not perhaps in your own mind, but with the community, because one of the issues is understanding gender inequality when you're talking to the community. Is that a fair observation?
I think so. A lot of the times, and I'm just going to speak from my perspective, Alistair, but as a faculty member, my job is to, work at the university 60% of my time, which doesn't mean a lot to people outside of a university, but the majority of my time is teaching. And then another portion is research, and the outreach and the programmatic efforts aren't always, the main bread and butter for the work that I do. And so as a researcher at a university, I don't have oftentimes the ability to build the depth of connection that I need in order to do this transformative work. I have to rely, and I always partner with people on the ground. They know their realities, and they're the gatekeepers for the community engagement. And so that, I can't stress enough the importance of their engagement. But even then, even just kind of involving them in the research process and involving in the development of the questions and involving them in this process, at the end of the day, they're not often the ones that are going to be making the changes needed in that community. They can highlight some leaders, important leadership that needs to be at the table for this discussion and to kind of take on the findings as well. But sometimes that step isn't taken. And so what I am trying to do in the work that I hope to do moving forward, because like I said, I am still very much working on this. It is, like you said, the gold standard, but how the heck do we do it? And how do we do it well? And so what the things that I want to make sure that I do in the future is, as I'm incorporating this on the ground entity and change agents of that community, I want to make sure that they're involved in understanding what I find through this research, what we find through the co-development of the research. Those things you need to take ownership, and how then do you change dynamics within your community? And I guess a lot of the times we say gender transformative research, but we're not the ones that need to be making the change for those communities. And oftentimes funders want to take credit for change in communities. You know, they want to see, how did my money help that community be better? But at the end of the day, that's almost a very colonial mentality, because, you know, we should be empowering the communities to make change for themselves. And that's why when Maria Elisa read my bio, I am very much a proponent of evidence-based, research-based solutions. If we continue to do research, we can really impact the work that we do, increase sustainability of the work that we do, and really just continue to move more towards transforming communities and the livelihoods of women. So Alistair, you and we can talk about this all day long, because I've got so many ideas. I would love to touch base at a different time, but this is definitely something that is a challenge, and particularly a challenge for faculty really seeking to make a difference in this space, just because of where we work and what we do.
I hope you, thank you. I hope you don't mind if I do follow up with you, because this would be a great conversation for me to have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
And
okay,
Lisa, sorry, Rebecca Ginodi actually had a question.
Right, I know. So I asked her to unmute herself to actually ask her a question. And then we have one from Umbule. So go ahead, Rebecca.
Thank you. I apologize for jumping in again as someone who also worked on GROWS. I feel I should leave the mic to other people. But a couple of 2 points occurred to me, Mary, as you were talking. And one was that one of the things that came out from GROWS was the very strong influence of different contextual factors, social, economic, political, institutional, across the 3 countries that we worked in, and knowing that you work a lot with New American populations as well. I was wondering if you could speak to geographic context and how that matters for designing transformative research. And sort of coupled to that, the other part of context is knowing your experience working in agriculture, and this was a water project. How does other kinds of sectoral or other types of context matter for transformative research?
Yeah, thanks, Beth, for those questions. The context is absolutely important, and it has to be, you have to consider not just the context of the community with their culture and, you know, all of their norms, but you also have to understand the context of the country. So across the 3 different countries, we saw that water was under different ministries even, and then people who were responsible for water at the rural and local level were different entities. It might have been local government, it might have been all the way up to the ministry, and so those things actually have a huge impact. You also brought up the politics. Our colleague Amanda Robinson studies politics, and she mentioned many times, she said, you know, the politics of a country can actually really impact the water resources that are going to an area, or even the management. The way that different governments will change and say, well, this management now needs to be a conglomeration of community managed systems, or it needs to be under a government system, or it needs to be taken on completely by a non-governmental or private business. And so all of those contexts make a huge difference when it comes to water governance. And when you're thinking about gender transformative work, you can't ignore all of those pieces, because those structures impact the laws, the policies that are actually implemented at the local level for the well-being of the woman and her agency to engage in decision making and access to resources. So yeah, you have to understand all of these very intricate multi-level contexts to see how can you actually implement change at the local level. That's something that our project did, I believe, very well. We looked at absolutely as many levels of context to the situations as we could, and we found that that has significant impact on the work, on the findings that we found in each country. Your second question about multi-sector collaboration or considerations for gender transformative work, that's what I mentioned kind of briefly at the end, but the importance and the essential nature of looking at gender transformative work through a systems thinking or systems perspective is absolutely essential. You cannot make change in one area and not consider the way it's going to have an impact in other areas. So just like I said earlier, in that gender transformative work of men and women working together, and what do we have to change for them to actually be able to make changes in their societies, we have to consider all of these different pieces, all the way from the gender relationships in the household to the decision making with agriculture. What impact does that maybe have for what does that maybe have for markets and economic development? What does that have to do with maternal mortality and infant health? So there's a lot of different dynamics that you have to consider for gender transformative research. Thank you for asking that question, because I don't think I talked about that enough, but the importance of that is essential.
Could we have Umule with a question, and then Angela? And Umule, if I didn't pronounce your name right, I'm very sorry. Please introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah, you got it right. Umule Njai. So it's a French pronunciation, but yeah, you got it right. So thank you for the presentation. I find it very interesting. So I have a question. You mentioned that or you wish to get like your finding taken into account for systemic changes. So I was wondering if you guys could use platforms like the World Water Forum that will be organized in Senegal. I think it would be great if you guys could have like time spot during which you can explain these results, these findings to authorities, and also, you know, what organization that will be gathering there.
That's so, Omule, thank you very much for that comment. I think that getting our research out there is absolutely essential. And I will say that you know, the research is contextually based, and so it is findings from very specific case studies within Tanzania, within Uganda, and within Kenya. They are not representative of the entire country itself. They're not even representative of the regions. They were very focused on certain case studies because they were unique, and we sought to better understand their specific context. So I think that presenting the approach that we took and also presenting some of the general findings as opportunities for further research in areas like Senegal, I think would be very interesting. And I think it would challenge and have an opportunity for researchers and folks working in the areas of water in Senegal and other West African countries, then I think, to begin the discussion and to think about, like I talked about here, gender transformative work and what that could actually look like. So thank you so much for that comment. And if you want to connect with me or my colleague Rebecca Gianotti on this work and presenting this work somehow to other stakeholders, I think we'd be very happy to do that.
Oh, great. Yeah, I would appreciate working with you guys. I found this interesting, and it's kind of, the same scenario that we can observe in many countries, like in West Africa. So, yeah, definitely, I'd be happy with you. Thank you. And by the way, I'm also a student I was a graduate student in the water IGF here at Tech, so it would be a great occasion to work with those guys as well.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me read a question from Angela Nealon. Her question is about resources to learn more about gender transformation, particularly with women and girls and water. So people, publications, geographic locations, where, let me see, I got distracted. Geographic locations where projects are having impacts. She says in her experience, the young girls carry much of the water. In one location in Ethiopia's dry highlands, girls spend 6 hours per day fetching water. How can we lighten their loads?
So that's an excellent question. And to be completely transparent, I don't know all the things that are happening out there to direct you, but I will actually drop in the chat one of the most impactful, I believe, gender transformative, or a really great example of how to actually conduct gender transformative work. I'm going to go ahead and just drop that in the chat for everybody, because I think that this would be a resource that is readily available to folks if you want to learn more. And I think in a response to that question, the challenge is up to us to do more of this gender transformative work and see the greater impact that we can create, because there's actually not a lot of this happening, and not a lot of it is being conducted truly transformative. It's still, again, more of that gender responsive work.
Okay. Unless I've missed something, I don't see another question in the chat, but remember, this is actually called the Women Gender Development Discussion Series. So really, it's hard because we're in Zoom to get this feeling of us sitting together in one room with food and coffee and tea like we would have at the library here at Virginia Tech normally without COVID. But in those cases, people would come up and talk to the speaker at the end. So I want you to have that feeling. We did put the link in, Lumbini put the link in for the survey, and it really is important to us. It's always amazing how few people do that survey. So really, please do the survey. It's very short. But this is your chance to also speak with Mary. So, you might have opinions and not just questions. So just stay on topic, please. The broad topic, women, gender transformative research. But just raise your hand if I don't see any hands raised. Am I missing a hand? No.
I shocked you guys into silence. Oh man. I want to just say, as we kind of wrap up this part, good research leads to a lot more research, a lot more questions. And so that's something that I take away every time I do research, and especially when I'm really doing gender responsive research.
In the evening. So hello to everyone.
You might be the farthest